as a part of that, even though we say we're not an island, but we do factor into that grouping. And so there are many challenges. For Belize, this discussion is not abstract. It is personal. We live daily with the realities of climate change. The storms have become stronger, as a matter of fact. Coastal erosion, when we hear about Monkey River, and I heard Honorable Martinez speak about the erosion in Monkey River, droughts and threats to food and energy security, yet we also live with the conviction that resilience is possible when we pool our resources, our creativity, and our determination as a region. And so the focus, in fact, is on the region, even though there is a focus on Belize, there's a focus on the region because there are certain challenges that we have. And so there are things like climate action. What are we doing with respect to the reduction of greenhouse gases? Economic diversification. Too often, putting your eggs in one basket creates an issue. And so what happens, for example, when the pandemic hits us, and whether or not we focus on that, if they did have a climate aspect to it, but we see what can happen when there's a focus on one industry and how it affects your gross domestic product. Capital accountability. The focus on this CCRF focuses a lot on small and medium enterprises. And because it does, then it simply means, do they have the wherewithal? Access to capital simply means there must be accountability for that capital. But how can you account for that capital if, in fact, you do not have the capacity in the sense that you don't have the expertise, the training necessary in order to do so, to ensure that that project comes to fruition? The regional impact experience, how does it affect the region? From my reading, it tells me that this facility allocates some $100 to $135 million. So how do we access it? Has Belize been accessing it? And those are the questions that we want to ask. And of course, capacity building. I heard that in a previous conversation just now. Many times when we talk about things like climate adaptation, and I'm sure that we'll get into that discussion a bit further, but if you don't have the capacity in order to do so, and I'll give you one quick example. In the sugar industry, it says for every % reduction in precipitation, there is an converse effect on productivity. And because of the fact that, in essence, the less precipitation we have, it simply means there's greater exposure. But if there is no adaptation in terms of methodologies, technologies, etc., then how do they mitigate that? And so it is important for us to do that. And I think I will leave that as the opening and then pass it on to you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Let me just use this opportunity to say I swear I had the fireside of this chat already over lunch while standing in the heat. It goes to show what climate change is really doing in our countries. I also want to take this opportunity to thank BELTRAIDE and the organizers of this summit to invite us here to speak about the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, a fund that is very dear to my heart, that I was very instrumental in structuring, and happy really to talk about it and really just to explain how Belize and the SMEs in Belize can really tap into this fund in terms of access to finance. So I'm the senior economist with the CARICOM Development Fund, and my primary role really is to structure and innovate financing instruments. And when we were given the mandate by heads of government to develop this fund, it came in a context where we ought to seek to tap into the liquidity in the region from private sector, from other financing institutions within the region. And it was quite timely because it came at a time where international financing, international assistance pretty much is drying up. It hasn't completely gone cold, but it's drying up. And the question then arises, how do we then tap into the private sector? How do we tap into our own resources to fund our own development? And that is the crux of the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund. The fund really came through technical assistance to the USAID, funny enough. The USAID, which maybe another 5-10 years from now, people will be asking, what was that, or what is that? But very instrumental to us. And it really goes to show how catalytic technical assistance can be. The Caribbean Community Resilience Fund is brought to bear within two frames in terms of its objectives. It seeks to propel economic development and economic sustainability, and it also seeks to address climate resilience in a context where we know exactly what his CEO spoke in his opening about what's happening with climate action, what's happening especially in our islands, in our island state. We see sea level increasing, we see coastal erosion, we're having hotter summers. I mean, come on, females, we talk about having our own summers, but we certainly, we know that some of this heat we cannot attribute to having our own summers. Gentlemen, forgive me. But really, in this context, what we're saying is that we need to be funding these type of projects such that we can address some of the things, although we're not primarily responsible for some of these things. It's happening to us, so we have to take responsibility to address these issues. So essentially, what's happening with the fund is we've done several things with the fund in order to attract the resources that we're seeking to do. And it's a blended financing fund. Blended, I heard the word thrown about earlier, which really is important because many a times, especially within a government context, within a public sector context, the government shouldn't be responsible or be the sole financier of some of these projects. But what is important, though, is that we ought to differentiate from what is commercially viable versus what really is a public good. What is commercially viable, of course, we would expect that the private sector now would have a role to play in that regard, because then it can generate and identify its returns on investments, and therefore it makes sense for them to invest in. If it's not commercially viable and considered a public good, then certainly the government then has a role to play in that regard. So in structuring this fund, we determined that we wanted this fund to target the private sector projects specifically, because the private sector, being that mechanism of growth within any economy, needs to be able to access financing easily and access financing in a sense where financing wouldn't necessarily or normally be available. So in structuring the fund, we said, okay, we need to look at the demand side and on the supply side. On the supply side, we're looking at the investors who would come in to fund, provide capital for this fund. And who are these investors? We're looking at the unconventional sources, and this is where the blended financing comes in. We're looking at the typical multilateral development banks. We're looking at all the foundations, family offices that have deep pockets and have an interest and a mandate to fund some of these type of projects, but they just are not seeing the opportunities in the region. We're crowding in the private sector, and when we speak about private sector, we're talking about your pension funds, your large institutions, your corporate offices that has all this liquidity sitting on, looking for yield, and can't find the returns to come up with. So we've been able to do that simply by utilizing what is called first loss capital. first loss capital. This is important because first loss capital is that quiet mechanism in finance that really is making modern financing tick, especially in the Caribbean region now. What it does, it's kind of like an insurance policy. It attracts resources and investments that you typically wouldn't find coming through to the fore, because it acts as a de-risking mechanism that pretty much de-risk the most risk-averse set of investors and say, look, you bring your monies to us, this first loss capital will act as that buffer in the event of a loss, in the event of a default. And this has been catalytic in a sense where the CDF itself has provided 15 million in first loss capital, and it's attracted 9 times that amount of monies to fund this Caribbean Community Resilience Fund. So that being said, I wanted to push back to CEO to find out really what role does the local ministries in Belize have to play in terms of actually helping to prepare some of these projects to really capitalize and benefit from the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund?
You know, sometimes one of the big challenges we have when it comes to access to finance, let me just use one of these analogies working in trade. There is market access, but it's all about market entry. The issue here is many times you hear that monies are available, but how do you access this? Because the process of access or to access is prohibitive. And so when you really think about that, so much paperwork that I need to go through. And we have seen cases where Belize has made attempts to try to access financing, but it comes right back to capacity building. And so to answer your question, the question about what can ministries do, as a matter of fact, let me just give kudos to the Ministry of Economic Transformation. I think they have been working, really tirelessly, because we cannot also look just at one money source. And as much as possible, if the public purse does not have to be utilized in some of these cases, because you do have these funding schemes, but the question is, are we prepared to do so? And so one of the things they have done, as a matter of fact, is go through the whole process of accreditation. So we have heard about the Green Climate Fund and other funds that allow us to finance climate resilient projects. And so when I mentioned, for example, the case of the cane farmers, where the cane farmers and working along with the 5 Cs, they are looking at mitigating measures, because if you're using primitive sources to deal with climate change, you really can't do so. And so the negative externalities that you face, these are things you cannot counter. And so there was that intervention. And so the climate action or climate adaptation process in that case will now help them. Because one of the things we don't do is to collect data. And the data tells you, as I mentioned before, reduction in precipitation. Also, a negative effect or converse effect is a reduction in productivity. But apart from that, when it gets too dry, and then we're fighting for serum and some of these other diseases, but what can ministries do? Ministries, and you referenced BELTRAIDE, and BELTRAIDE is there to me. But what they have done in many cases, maybe not so much in the area of climate resilience, and these are something you can focus on, how do I fill out these forms? What's the process that I need to go through? In essence, we must assist with project development, project proposals. The proposals must be viable. They must be bankable. And if that happens, then of course you have the whole monitoring and evaluation process, because there must be accountability for these financing. I think the other thing that we can mention, since you say ministries, and the focus which is there to me, is one of them is renewable energy. And that's a big focus for the country. As a matter of fact, there is a task that the Prime Minister has levied on a group of individuals to come up with a least cost expansion plan looking at, focusing on renewables. But the other ministry is the Ministry of Blue Economy. And that's a ministry that was established in 2020 with a focus because the world was focusing. So even if you were doing it in a disaggregated manner, it's more aggregated and you can focus resources and access resources as well. But then you also have sustainable housing. We are in the hurricane belt. And you can't continue to build homes that are not resilient, but there's a cost factor to that. So when there is no hurricane, my house still stands there. So these are the kind of things that we have to continue to focus on. So in terms of the ministries, we must work cohesively because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to keep making the same mistakes because that's costly and using funding that you can use in essence for greater preparation. So it's a matter of working together to ensure that when it comes to accessing these funding, and again, the focus group, small and medium enterprises, too often they do not have the technical capabilities, they need the training, etc. And if they were to factor that into their own costs, it becomes prohibitive to produce. So that's a problem. And those who live in the more vulnerable areas, that makes it even more challenging. SMEs can also, in any area, but do they want to go there? You mentioned risk averse. Do I want to go there? Do I want to invest to make sure that I'm climate resilient? That's going to, what am I really? And so therefore they need the guidance. We don't need to go into industries that are saturated. So we need the guidance. We need the economic diversification. Those things are important. And so it simply means then that you create a macroeconomic opportunity where they grow, and of course we become even more resilient, but we're able to access these funding schemes that are streams that actually exist. So the ministries can play that role, working in harmony, reaching out to the MSMEs, getting them prepared, finding where in the case of CCRF, knowing how to access that and to ensure that we continue to benefit. So those are some of the things from a public side, those are some of the things that we can do.
Thank you so much for that. It's funny, while listening to you, I was just checking all the boxes in terms of the sector priority areas that the CCRF focuses on. So while the CCRF is sector agnostic, meaning that we have no target sector that we're strictly focusing on, we have 7 sectors that we prioritize. And that includes the blue economy that you mentioned. It includes smart climate agriculture, which is also important, and I heard as one of the priority areas for Belize as you continue to build out the economy. We're looking at sustainable housing. You mentioned that in terms of being climate resilient. We're looking at also ICT, your financial services, transport. When we talk about transport, we're talking about ensuring that you're basically transitioning from your gas to your electric vehicle, that kind of thing. Anything that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions is critical to getting to climate resilience. We're also looking at the circular economy, a very important part for us to play, because how do you dispose of your waste? That's critical. And we've seen quite a number of projects in the pipeline that looks at basically translating or transposing waste into energy. We're seeing the issue of sargassum. I don't know if Belize has that problem, but we're seeing it right across the region, and we're seeing projects in the pipeline where sargassum is being translated and repurposed into diesel or repurposed into some sort of gas. And I see that my time is up, but permit me to finish. The point is, when we talk about small and medium-sized enterprises and diversifying the economy, there's so much scope, there's so much potential within the climate resilience space, within the socio-economic sustainability, and I see so much potential for Belize. What we're not seeing, however, is that drive, that energy, that push. When we came to do the study and develop the pipeline for Belize, one of the things we heard was, well, we can get loans in the single digit, but we're not interested in getting equity financing. And I think there is a gap there in terms of knowledge and the role that certain types of financing can play in propelling small businesses beyond where they need to go. And that that CEO is, I'm promoting you. I'm seeing in the future, don't worry. That, I think, is an important thing to address. Secondly, within the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, we have what's called a technical assistance sidecar. So while the BELTRAIDE is providing technical assistance to help small and medium-sized enterprises get into projects that would be more bankable, what we're doing is we're providing mentorship, we're providing a seat on the board, we're providing that level of technical assistance, that from that baby stage right through to ensuring the success of this project. It's not a one-off technical assistant. It's a sustainable technical assistant that sees through the life of the project. This technical assistance project sidecar is actually funded by Global Affairs Canada, so we have the funding available, and it's grant funded for the projects within the CCRF. And I'll stop here.
Let me just quickly say this, though. Again, we keep hearing, when it says financial services, it simply means that it should be concessional. Because if it's prohibitive for me to access it, that poses an issue. If the paperwork is already too much, because you notice whenever I fill out a form and it's too long, then people just stop filling it out. But when you look at the interest rate, and so let us say if it was blended financing, for example, I heard the word catalytic. You can't get to catalytic financing if there is not preliminary financing. And so there is a need to do that and look at success stories and a project's timeline, and when it receives or you can see success, that's when money follows success. And so these are the kind of things, like I said, we have to look at. Climate change is real. With climate change, if we become more resilient in all aspects that we're talking about, because the technical assistance, the capacity building, you mentioned sargassum. As a matter of fact, I had 3 meetings, 2 today, talking about conversion of sargassum to energy. And not only that, byproducts, because you can get byproducts. And you mentioned the circular economy. Circular economy, you think about Singapore, nothing wastes. And so therefore, it's the same thing that we're looking at. As a matter of fact, if we can adopt a circular economy model, that would also help. But again, it's the underlying foundational aspect of it is financing. And the question is, when you talk about equity, I am more risk averse when it comes to using my equity, but using somebody else's money, it's easier for me to do so. You see, and failure to pay, then I disappear. And so these are the kind of things that we have to look at, but we need to create an environment where people can understand, and of course, working with the commercial institution, finding facilities that can access it, because at the end of the day, if you have more disposable income and more savings, my deposits become your revenue base. And so these are things that we really have to focus on. But yes, indeed, renewables, Belize is always a leader, and Belize is always ready to lead. When we talk about CARICOM, many times is Belize is leading or someone is leading, and then you don't see the followers. And what I mean by that is the CARICOM needs to work and move in cohesion as well. Because as we know it, if a member of CARICOM does not agree with something and how it's going to work when you look for harmonization, it stagnates and sometimes it never comes back. But the financing facility for the CCRF, I mean, these are monies that are available. We need to get our people prepared. We need to get those bankable projects. And I can assure you that, really in terms of the harmony that exists within the ministries, and I just mentioned some of the ministries, we are ready to access it. It simply means now that we have to go back now and further, go through the training and the preparation, etc. But we don't put all our eggs in one basket because these are measures and things that we have to use. When you think about our sugar industry and its output, it contributes so much to gross domestic product. A reduction in that creates an issue. How do we fix that deficit? So it's better now to take proactive, reactive measures that will help us to become more competitive. Loss of sugar quota in one of those markets, that's an issue for us. And believe me, in a circular manner, it affects our macroeconomy in many ways.
Yeah, I know time is up. Where is the time? Can we have one more point in, if you don't mind? Yeah, so I needed to make a clarification and then make a point on, I started the discussion on the supply side and the demand side. So the clarification I'd like to make is, on the supply side, we have our investors coming in to capitalize the fund. On the demand side, we have the project developers, which is the small and medium-sized enterprises, who are demanding these types of capital. Within the fund, there are two types of capital that we're offering. We're offering debt capital, which is your typical loans, so you come in and you borrow accordingly. We're also offering equity capital. Equity capital meaning that you're not taking your capital as the business owner, but the fund is putting in capital as equity, meaning that it's taking part ownership of your company, of your project, of the development that you're into. And then at the end of the day, what we're doing is taking an extra governance oversight to ensure that you get to the point of returns, you get to the point of growth that is required, so that when we get to exit stage, exit meaning that it's now time for us to get back our equity that we inputted or invested in the business. And easily, exit can come in various forms. It can come in you, the owner of the business, of the project, buying back the equity from the investor. It can come as us basically translating or really just repositioning equity back into debt, which I don't know which investor or developer would want to do that. Or you can find an alternative investor outside of the fund to really shore up in terms of the capital to ensure you continuing growth. So that's on the demand side, so the supply and on the demand. And then I wanted to get now a sense of what Belize is doing in terms of trying to access these funds. Because one of the things we recognize when we reached out to potential investors within Belize, we heard the issue of foreign currency and the constraints there. And although we thought to structure it such that we could capitalize on local currency, recognizing this is a regional fund, so of course we have multiple currencies addressing there. The simple currency for us to operate in was US dollars. And of course we had some issues there. And I don't know, CEO, if you can speak on that, or if something we can take as a sidebar, but it would be important that you're not only just benefiting on the demand side, but also on the supply side as investors seek returns and yields. Thanks.
I believe, and you said time is up, right?
Yes.
But
I mean, we could go on.
Yes,
we could go on
yes,
all
yes. But
afternoon,
just to quickly say, one of the challenges, of course, is when it comes to having a facility for the transfer of funds, and of course, foreign exchange, because when it comes to trade, we import more than we export. There's a need to have forex, available at least for 3 months or 4 months. And so that poses a challenge for us, which we've always and continue to have a challenge in which to do so. But these are the things we need to find. And then you mentioned the whole thing about using the US dollar, yes, as the currency, as a currency of exchange. But I could remember this having discussions in CARICOM, and they said, well, okay, if Belize and Barbados change your peg and go floating like Guyana and the others, we can have a market. See, we can have a financial market established within CARICOM. Belize will never move away from that peg. Whether Barbados will, I don't think so either. So that is one of the challenges that was posed. And so some of these mechanisms that we need to have in place, there is a need for us to focus even more on that. And that's the situation that occurs when you try to trade intra, when you try to get into greater trade. CARICOM as a block can really benefit even more from each other. And there is no need, we still have to seek and look for further comparative and competitive advantages. But what happens? Because of the climate conditions, etc., we tend to want to do the same thing. It's like going into a saturated market and you know for a fact that tomorrow you might leave because you can't price above anybody else because of production costs. So these are things and all the factors that we have to look at, but still, we can't use our currency as a means of exchange outside of our borders. Yes, in Mexico, some parts of maybe, something like that. But these are the mechanisms that we really have to work at and to make sure when we look at trade and everything else, how is that facilitated? And I can tell you that the Ministry of Trade continues to explore that.
Okay, great. Thank you. One shameless plug. To get more information on the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, go to www.caribbeanclimateresilience.com. Thank you.